through plundered gold, stolen land, or even direct taxation, but through debt. Not debt as we understand it today, but a quiet, technical, almost invisible kind. Numbers written in ledgers, promises denominated in pounds sterling, obligations that outlived empires. When Britain left India in 1947, it didn't leave empty-handed. It left behind something far more powerful than soldiers or governors, a financial system that locked India into Britain's post-war recovery. This is the story of how Britain's debt, its shortages, its war expenses, its imperial accounting tricks helped forge modern India's economy, and how a collapsing empire used currency instead of cannons to extract value long after independence. The mystery is simple, but unsettling. How did the colonizer end up owing money to the colony and still walk away richer? To answer that, we have to rewind not to 1947, but to the moment when the British Empire stopped conquering with armies and started ruling with balance sheets. By the late 18th century, Britain wasn't just building an empire, it was building the world's financial system. At the center of that system stood one institution, the Bank of England, and one currency, the pound sterling. Sterling wasn't just money. It was trust. It was credit. It was the language in which global trade was settled. India, then under the East India Company, was not merely a colony. It was the empire's financial engine. India supplied raw materials, cotton, jute, tea, opium. India consumed British manufactured goods. India generated massive tax revenues paid in rupees. But here's the twist. Those rupees rarely stayed in India. Instead, Britain designed a system where India's trade surpluses were converted into sterling credits held in London. India exported more than it imported. India earned the difference, but Britain held the earnings. This mechanism would later be called sterling balances. At first it looked harmless, even beneficial. India, after all, was earning claims on Britain, claims denominated in the world's most trusted currency. But claims are not cash, and trust can be weaponized. Let's break the system down simply. When India exported goods, foreign buyers paid in sterling. That sterling went to London, not to Indian producers. Instead, the British government credited India with a balance on IOU. On paper, Britain owed India money. In reality, Britain controlled when, how, and whether that money could be used. Why? Because 1. Sterling was not freely convertible. 2. Britain imposed strict controls on how colonies could spend their balances. 3. Most of India's earnings could only be used to buy British goods or to fund British expenses. This is where cause and effect begins to reveal itself. India's wealth financed British wars, paid for imperial administration, subsidized Britain's balance of payments deficits. Without India, Britain's global position would have collapsed much earlier. And the deeper the empire went into crisis, the more it relied on India's forced savings. The system existed before World War I, but World War II turned it into a financial time bomb. Britain entered the war nearly bankrupt. Its gold reserves were draining. Its industrial base was strained. Its imports, especially food and raw materials, were essential for survival. India provided both, but Britain couldn't pay. So instead of cash, Britain paid India with more sterling balances. By the end of World War II, Britain owed India over £1.3 billion in sterling balances, a staggering sum for the 1940s. India held the largest sterling credit of any country in the world. In reality, Britain was broke. This contradiction is the core of the story. Britain owed India, but Britain controlled the system, and control matters more than debt. During this period, critical decisions were made by men far from Indian voters or factories. John Maynard Keynes, Britain's most famous economist, was deeply involved in post-war financial planning. British Treasury officials feared one thing above all else. If India demanded its money, sterling would collapse. A sudden conversion of Indian balances into dollars or gold would trigger a run on the pound, destroy Britain's ability to import food, and Britain's role as a global financial power. So Britain delayed, and delayed again, and negotiated with itself. By the mid-1940s, three forces were colliding. 1. Indian nationalism was unstoppable. 2. Britain was economically exhausted. 3. Sterling balances were unpayable. Independence was no longer a question of if only how. But here's the critical insight. Britain didn't just negotiate borders and governance in 1947. It negotiated debt repayment schedules. The transfer of power happened under financial constraints designed in London. India inherited, a fragile economy, partition-related devastation, and a massive claim on Britain that it could not freely use the empire ended politically. But financially, it simply changed form. When India finally became independent in August 1947, celebrations filled the streets, but the treasury told a colder story. The British Empire was gone. The British financial system was not. India inherited a state without monetary sovereignty in any meaningful sense. Its foreign exchange earnings earned through decades of surplus trade were still locked inside Britain's sterling system. On paper, India was owed over £1.3 billion. In practice, Britain decided, when India could spend it, on what it could be spent, at what exchange value it would be honored. This wasn't colonialism by gunboat, it was colonialism by convertibility. Britain imposed sterling area rules, meaning India's reserves had to remain in pounds and could only be used within an approved framework, converting those balances into dollars, what India desperately needed for machinery, technology, and reconstruction required British consent, and Britain almost never gave it. Why? Because Britain couldn't afford to. If India cashed out freely, the pound would collapse, Britain's food imports would stop, its post-war welfare state would fail before it even began. So Britain did the unthinkable. It asked its former colony to wait. Every year of delay mattered. While India waited, inflation eroded the real value of sterling balances. The pound was repeatedly devalued, shrinking India's purchasing power. Britain used Indian credits to settle its own international obligations. This is the critical cause and effect chain. 1. Britain delays repayment gives 2. Sterling weakens under post-war pressure gives 3. India's claims lose value gives 4. Britain effectively repays less than it owes. No confiscation, no announcement, just arithmetic. By the time substantial repayments occurred, India had already lost a significant portion of the real value of its wartime earnings. This is how debt becomes extraction after empire. This financial reality directly shaped India's economic ideology. Post-independence leaders, especially Jawaharlal Nehru, not distrust markets because of abstract socialism. They distrusted markets because foreign exchange had been weaponized against them. India faced acute dollar shortages, limited import capacity, dependence on a former colonizer for access to its own wealth, so India turned inward. The result was centralized economic planning, import substitution, industrialization, heavy state control over foreign trade and currency. These decisions are often criticized today as ideological mistakes, but in context, they were defensive moves. India had learned a brutal lesson. Political independence means nothing without monetary independence. The sterling legacy taught Indian policymakers that global markets were not neutral, they were hierarchical. India did try to renegotiate. British officials made promises, gradual release of balances, partial dollar convertibility, like long-term repayment schedules, but every fix protected one thing above all else: sterling. Even when Britain formally devalued the pound in 1949, India had no choice but to accept the loss. Its reserves fell in value overnight through a decision made in London. The system was reformed, but never dismantled. By the time the sterling area truly weakened in the 1960s, Britain had stabilized its economy. India had already absorbed decades of constraint. The transfer was complete. Here's the uncomfortable part. This story isn't unique to India, and it isn't over. Today, the pound has been replaced by the US dollar. Global trade is settled in dollars, reserves are held in dollars. Debt is denominated in dollars. Countries accumulate claims on the system, but control remains centralized. We've seen this play out through dollar liquidity crises, sanctions that freeze reserves, sudden exchange rate shocks. The mechanism is familiar. You earn surpluses, you hold them in someone else's currency, and access depends on political permission. Sterling taught the world this model. The dollar perfected it. Today, over 60% of global reserves are held in dollars. Most developing countries borrow in foreign currencies. A single policy change by a reserve issuer can reshape entire economies, just as Britain once feared India cashing out sterling. Modern powers fear reserve diversification. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes with brutal precision. 3 clear takeaways. 1. Empire didn't end, it evolved. Control shifted from territory to currency, from governors to central banks. 2. Debt is power when you control the rules of repayment. Britain owed India and still won. 3. Monetary sovereignty is the real independence. Flags and constitutions matter, but currencies decide outcomes. India's story forces a difficult question: if wealth can be extracted without occupation, if debt can outlive empire, if control can be exercised through systems instead of soldiers, then how many countries today are independent in name but constrained in practice? And more importantly, who is holding their sterling now? If this story changed how you see colonialism, debt, or global finance, share it, because financial history is often hidden for a reason. Subscribe for more deep cause and effect explanations of how money shapes power, and leave a comment. Do you think today's global financial system is fundamentally different, or just a modern version of the same hierarchy? Because understanding the past isn't about blame. It's about recognizing the system before it recognizes you.